All right, well, welcome to you all. Thank you for coming this evening. We're very excited to be doing this program as we're heading into next week when we celebrate Yom HaShoah. And we're also, this is sort of a companion program to the Butterfly Project, which we're bringing to the JCC in our community. We can talk a little bit more about that later. So I want to introduce our speaker. We're thrilled to have you here. Dr. Sarah Snyder. She holds a PhD in the history of ideas with a focus in Holocaust studies through the University of Texas at Dallas, and holds the position of director at the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center, otherwise known as HERO Center, located in Farmington, Connecticut. In addition to her role as director, she has been elected a member of the advisory board for the International Association of Genocide Scholars. In 2022, her article, The Dichotomy of Tourism at Auschwitz and Birkenau in the Context of Memory, will be published in Visitor Engagement with Holocaust Memory Sites in Poland. Prior to her current work, Sarah earned her master's from the University of Buffalo in Cultural Anthropology. During that time, she conducted original research in museology at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she received the award, If Not for Those 10. So welcome, Dr. Sarah Snyder, with us this evening, talking to your kids about the Holocaust. And I will let me spotlight you, and I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you for having me. So before I start sharing my screen, I just want to quickly ask if you can put in chat if you have kids or grandkids, kind of what age brackets they are, just so I kind of know who I'm speaking to, and make sure I focus in on the right age groups for you. So if you just want to pop that in. So far, it looks like we have a good mix, so that's great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about how we can talk to kids about the Holocaust. And then at the end, we can have a conversation. I think we're a small enough group where we can get off mute and just talk and have a very informal conversation about it. So the first thing I do want to mention, these are just suggestions that I have. Certainly, you're going to know your kids or your grandkids best. One kid who's in 5th grade might be more mature than another kid who's in 5th grade. So I do want to point that out. And they're just suggestions. So you're going to know best as the parent or the grandparent or the relative to the child. So I'm going to first look at kindergartners and 1st graders around the younger ages and look at an activity that I've actually experienced, and it's quite rewarding. And I call it the human family. And so we use We're Different, We're the Same. And it's a Sesame Street book. And it shows a lot of different characters from Sesame Street and also a lot of different children. And then what we can do is when we read the book to the child, talk about the different characters. What are they seeing? How are they different? And so the goal with this activity is to show that everybody is different, whether it be the color of their skin, their ethnicity, do they wear glasses? Are they in a wheelchair? All sorts of things. And the idea is to look at those differences and really honor those differences. So we want to show that we're different, but we're also all human beings. And so this book is a great way to do that because there are so many different characters. That being said, I know when I was younger, Sesame Street was not my favorite show. So you could do it with any show that's got a lot of different characters, or any book that has a lot of different characters. And you can just have that conversation and talk about who they're seeing, what they're seeing, and really just talk about differences and similarities. So I do want to point out that with these younger ages, I wouldn't use the term Holocaust. What I'm going to focus in on is representation, being inclusive, anti-bullying, those sort of themes. And then we have the Ugly Duckling. This one I did like as a child. So we have what I'm going to call teaching beyond tolerance. So we have this word tolerance, which is often just, how do we, it's not about acceptance. It's more like, it's okay, we get along, but I don't like you necessarily. But we want to take it to the next level, and we want people to actually engage with each other and get to know each other and be friends. So the Ugly Duckling does a really good job of highlighting differences and how that impacts, in this particular case, the baby swan. And so a conversation that can be had with children is talk about how this, what they call a duck, eventually you find out is a swan, feels, and what his response is to being pushed away by the other ducks because he's different. And so in turn, what you're doing is teaching children empathy. You're teaching them that being different is not necessarily a bad thing. And it opens conversations about people. And then you can relate it back to, how are you feeling? Do you feel different within your friend group? And is that okay? So essentially what these both are doing is just opening conversations to hear how your child is feeling. And both these books do a really good job of highlighting that. So this book, I would say, kind of transitions us to kind of second, third grade level. But personally, I love this book. I would use it in my college classes. I would use it with high schoolers. I would use it with adults. So it is Bread is a Simple Food. And essentially what this book does is it teaches children about culture. And it does it through food. And I am an avid lover of bread, so this is probably why I love this book. But the way to start out that I've used this is I start out, before I read the book, talking with children or even adults about different cultures and different themes within cultures. So for example, I have baby care and lullabies and how we eat as just examples. And I use those examples specifically because these are kids. So they, maybe they have dolls, so they understand what babies are, or, they've heard lullabies. And of course, they also have eaten food. That being said, you can pick any theme within a culture and talk about it. But I find that these are great topics for little kids to talk about, and talk about what each culture does. And it's going to be a little bit different. So for example, if we think about the eating one, here in the United States, we use utensils of forks and knives and spoons, but you also have chopsticks. You have cultures that use their hands to eat. Where do they sit? Do they sit on a floor, in a chair? So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of talk about and show that there are differences. And by using this book, what the author has done is she talks about the different kinds of breads that different cultures use. And then when she actually presents it, what she'll do is she'll actually go out and buy different bread so you can eat it. I have to tell you, it was a phenomenal experience. We had about 20 different kinds of bread on this table, and we all got to eat. But of course, for the sake of it just being a small group, something that you could try doing is either making the bread a different kind of bread that you've never had with your child or grandchild, or you can go to the store and certainly just buy it and try it. But it opens up a conversation about different cultures and why they're different and how we're also similar. So I would say this is about the same age bracket, and it's in relationship to stereotyping. So I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but essentially there are two groups in this book, one with stars on their bellies and one without. And you can kind of see it in the picture on the cover. And essentially the Starbellys are seen as, the better group. And so what happens is those who don't have stars put stars on their bellies and think now that they're also these wonderful, not people, but snitches. And then everyone becomes the same. But of course, that makes everyone the same and no longer unique. And so we can have those conversations about why it's important to be different from other people, and how, uniqueness adds to being human beings. So these are just a few questions. And certainly at the end of this, I can send over some resources to Sharon if she wants to send it over to everyone that's registered as well. So there are a lot of great questions that come with these books. I just didn't want to overwhelm you with too many of them. But also something else that can be done is talking about what assumptions we make about both of these groups. And when you read the book, it highlights, the Starbellys didn't see themselves in one particular way until people told them, well, you're the better group. And so their perception of themselves changed as well. And so it really opens up a really good conversation to be had about how we view ourselves and how others view us. So this book is, I would say, a little bit older. We're getting kind of towards 4th, 5th grade. This book is mostly actually pictures, but I would still put it with 4th and 5th grade because I think that's the time really when kids start to really think about identity and who they are and start to, try to find themselves a little bit. So what this book is there's a hat I believe it's in a museum, and the child is speaking with a family member about the hat. And it's really curious whose hat it is. You find out later that the hat is from someone who was in the Holocaust, and you don't ever find out specifically who it is. But the child goes through this process of trying to identify with the hat and understand that I could have owned a hat. My mom could have owned a hat. You could have owned a hat. And really builds this empathy towards treating people kindly and understanding that in this case, the Holocaust could have happened to anyone. But they do a very good job of, not necessarily making it directly about the Holocaust. So I think it's a really great way to approach identity and who was involved. So I don't know if you noticed a theme. A lot of what I'm talking about is linked directly to books. You certainly don't have to use the books. I think they're a very good tool for K through 5. A lot of our kids still really love to read. They'll take the time to read. We're going to see a shift from reading in a moment. But one of the goals I have with the books that I've used is to really think about children being upstanders, children being empathetic, learning to get along with others. So they're really themes about being inclusive. Whereas kind of when we shift to kind of the middle school age, that's when I would start introducing terminology and history of the Holocaust, because at that point in time, they might start getting it in school, and the comprehension is going to be there a little bit further. So one really interesting way to introduce the idea of the Holocaust, I find, is looking at different clips. So this particular clip, and I can see if it plays. No. All right, well, this one's on YouTube. And what it is students, there's middle school and high schoolers in this particular clip, interviewing a Holocaust survivor. So it could easily have been the child that you're speaking to, and they're just asking questions to this individual. So they're very age-appropriate questions. And in this particular scenario, they certainly don't have a lot of terminology. It's not very heavy on historical facts. They're asking questions that middle school and high schoolers might be curious about. Additionally, it's not very graphic. So I would avoid looking at clips that have a lot of graphics or stories that are really heavy. And certainly you still know your child best. And so if you believe they're ready for that and that's appropriate, then that's up to you. Just looking at the younger middle schoolers that I've seen, I wouldn't broach that until they're a little bit older. I would also certainly preview any clips that you're going to look at on YouTube, because you never know what you're going to get. But this is a good approach to it, because the high schooler and the middle schoolers are kind of in charge of the questions and the interactions with the survivor. So I put this as a family time. A lot of families are going to have more than one child. And so my idea behind this is, right now with COVID and inability to travel, we're certainly seeing an opening up, but if you can't travel at the moment, or if you just have the time and want to do it from home, there are a lot of museums and sites that have opened their doors to virtual tours. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is one of them. And I can send this link over after the talk as well. But essentially, it walks you through the museum. There's also different talks you can click on for different age groups, which is really helpful. And so this is a great option to sit down, click around with your family members, so have a conversation about what you're seeing. And it also gives you an opportunity to visit a museum. There are other museums. I particularly picked this one because it does have conversation starters on their website, but there are certainly other sites that are available, and I can send those over as well. So I know I had mentioned I didn't use too many books. This is one of the few books that I did want to mention. I think it's really important to include the period after the Holocaust in conversations, and specifically looking at immigration. So this particular book, you can see kind of pictures in the background of this slide. It's called The Arrival. This story is not specific to the Holocaust. However, it is about an individual who leaves his family and has to immigrate. And it's showing the different struggles that occur during immigration. So for example, you can see kind of lettering in the background. The individual in this story doesn't know these languages. So within this book, it's actually just a picture book. There are no words. It simply gives you kind of a breakdown, like an abstract, before you start looking at the pictures. And what you can do with this book is have the child create a story on what they're seeing and what kind of struggles each photo is showing. And of course, not every single picture is a struggle. There are things that show, life improvements, which is really great to see, and the process of being an immigrant. So that's one thing you could do with this book. Another option, and you could approach this in many ways, is once they've looked at the book and you had a conversation, what you could do is you could have kind of a task and say, what would you put in a suitcase if you were to leave? And this could be anything from, from your bedroom, what would you take? Or from our house, what would you want to bring with you? Or you can even have them physically do it and then have a conversation and take out pieces and talk about, why did you want to bring this? What about this? And even talk about what they didn't pack. And so this in turn leads to a conversation about, what additional struggles happened after the Holocaust, but also it can lead to a bigger conversation about, what's happening currently, what's happened between the time of the Holocaust up to today. So it's really quite a large conversation that can be had. It just depends on where you want to take it. So this is a fishbowl activity, and this could also be a family activity. I don't think this needs to be specific to middle schoolers. But even yourself, I know I say that the kids can write down the questions, but certainly also as the adult, you can write down questions that you have and put them on a piece of paper and put them in the fishbowl. And then, take turns pulling them out and talking about the questions. And you do not need to know the answer to every question. I think that's a big part of learning, especially with the Holocaust, where, even Holocaust scholars are not going to have all the answers. But this will add on to having an open conversation. And also something you can do is, if you don't know the answer, you can always go online and look it up and make that an activity with your child. So it adds a nice layer of kind of letting people have conversations, but without necessarily the one-on-one pressure of asking the questions directly. So for middle schoolers, I would say one of the biggest additions is adding the terminology of the Holocaust, also doing more interactive activities with them beyond kind of reading and talking. So really what we're looking at is being the upstander, being empathetic, but also starting to take on kind of the history of what the Holocaust is. So moving into high schoolers, I really think that testimony is a great way to open up conversations. That being said, there is a plethora of testimony out there. So to kind of narrow it down, I would look at individuals who tell testimony around the age, who experience the Holocaust around the age of the child you're working with. That often adds a really nice way to connect to what they're listening to, because they might have experienced the same activities. They might have partook, in school things or sports. So that way they can connect a little bit further to what they're hearing. And it's not just someone speaking about their own experience. They might start thinking about it with a connection. There are lots of places to look for testimony. And I can send this list as well. We have, so at Voices of Hope, we have a website called CT Remembers the Holocaust, and that's going to be local survivors. And a few of them still speak in schools, so some of the students may have actually heard them speak. There are others as well. And then the United States Holocaust Museum, the USC Shoah Foundation, and then of course we can also go to YouTube. I would certainly suggest watching the testimony before showing it to a child, because you never really know what they're going to talk about. For example, you might have a woman who talks about being sexually assaulted. You might have a child talking about something very graphic. So you never know, what's going to come up throughout their story. So certainly take a look and make sure you kind of vet it through and make sure you're comfortable with your child hearing that. Another thing you might notice, I like food. But the other thing I was thinking is there's an activity of creating food with your family. So this is just one example of a cookbook that is based on survivors' recipes. There are many others. We're actually working on one at Voices of Hope now. But what you could do is you could get one of these cookbooks. They're certainly online as well, so you don't necessarily have to buy a cookbook. Pick out a recipe and make it with your children. And from there, have a conversation about it over dinner. And this could include the whole family. You can talk about, a lot of these books will give you background on the individual who had the recipe. They'll talk about, where it came from, both geographically as well as from their family members. Say it came from an aunt, or it came from a sibling, or whoever it might have come from. There'll be backstory often. So it's a great way to have a personal connection to the individual who had the recipe, but also a really great way to start a conversation about before the Holocaust and culture and traditions and Judaism. And so if your family, for example, is from a certain location and you find a recipe and you can talk about it that way, that's also a great way to connect. You can also do a movie night. Pretty straightforward. So this one, get the family together, or just, whoever wants to see it, and host a movie night. So there are a lot of Holocaust films. I only put a couple down here that are a little more age appropriate. I would say Son of Saul is probably the most graphic that I've put on this list, because it does take place in a concentration camp. The other ones are a little less graphic, but certainly you'll learn a lot about the Holocaust and different representations of the Holocaust. And what you could even do is have a couple nights where you do it and then talk about the different approaches. You can talk about the themes within it. You can talk about, even depending on the child, if they're interested in, cinema in general, how they approach it. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about after a movie night, but it's a great way to sit down, engage with the Holocaust. And it also kind of takes the onus off of, one person to have to ask a question and answer a question, because the movie's going to start that process for you. So this is one of the last ones I want to talk about. So up until this point, I would say most of the activities are driven by the parent or the grandparent or the adult in the relationship. This kind of switches the roles. So both of these ideas lets the child take on the role of essentially being in charge. So the first one, letting your kid interview a relative. That being said, it could be, excuse me, a part of your immediate family. It could be a part of your distant family, or even if it's not a relative, just somebody else they happen to know, someone who's close to the family, and ask them questions. So this could be a descendant, this could be a survivor, but it could also be just someone they know, and find out what they do know about the Holocaust, find out if they have questions about the Holocaust, and maybe have them write them down. And then from there, have them look these answers up and go back to another conversation with that individual, because you're allowing the kid to hear people and understand that they might not know as much either about the Holocaust. And so it opens up these conversations of, oh, I didn't know that. And it also lets them start to do a little bit of research and digging and seeing if, there's information out there that they want to find out. The second one is ask the expert, which is going to be the kid as well. And the idea behind this is the adult will come up with questions about the Holocaust that they have, and then they will ask the child. And they don't have to know the answers necessarily, but they can go out and get the answers. They can talk to a teacher. They can talk, to a descendant. They can go ahead and Google. And from there, they can go back and say, I know this, and present that information to the person who asked them. So both of these activities are really letting the kids kind of take charge and look up the information and then have conversations around them. And it doesn't have to be a one-time conversation. It can be something that they start and then go back to and continue to kind of have conversations as well. So I'm gonna bring this slide up later. So what I'd like to do is really go kind of to the more informal part of the conversation. So I know I just gave you a lot of information and a lot of different activities, and I can certainly share that PowerPoint as well with Sharon to send out if she doesn't mind sending it out. But I would love to hear if you have any questions. And if you've also had conversations with anybody of the age range that we're talking about and what you've done, because I think it's really important. There are a lot of ways to engage with children. And certainly these are just a few. I actually really had to cut back for the sake of time because there's so many different things you can do. So I'd love to hear what you think. And feel free just to unmute and speak.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sarah. So if we can, yeah, it's a small enough group, just chime in if you're able to put on your video, and let's just make this a conversation. I'm sure people have more specific questions. So anybody want to start this off?
I'll jump in, just because I've talked to lots of kids about the Holocaust. And I'm, basically always telling them the same story. So, but I do, the importance of adapting it to the age and their ability to take it in is just, I'm just so glad you're coming at it from that angle, because you can't say the same thing to 10th graders as you say to 7th graders, as you say to 4th graders. You just can't do it. So I'm yeah, absolutely got to do it that way. I was surprised on your films that you suggested, so many fictional ones that you had on your list, because I really have a trouble with the things that are just sort of a glommed together random story that could have happened that didn't happen that way.
Right.
Just my bias, but.
So that was something I actually struggled with as a historian. I sat there and struggled with it as well. So the other films that I had, unfortunately, it was a mix of, I would say, graphic scenes in multiple different ways that were there, which is why I kept them off. And there are certainly a lot of other films, and certainly I can add them to the list if wanted. But it is challenging to find a Holocaust film that doesn't have surprisingly nudity, or, and not even just in the sense of the Holocaust context, but in other ways as well. But also, graphic scenes of concentration camps. But that being said, there are films that, high schoolers could certainly watch that and not be inappropriate for them. So I agree. And I'll have to add some on there as well.
It's a hard.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Can I ask you a quick question? So I know I've heard great things about your talking to students. So I want to know, in what ways might you adapt your story when you do talk to different age groups?
Well, just sort of the vocabulary I choose as I tell the story. What words to describe the same thing?
How do you just
even
tell people that you're the child of a survivor?
Okay, so my mom's a survivor, and I've written a book about her, and I'm often invited to schools to tell her story. Next week, I'm going to be talking to a 4th grade. I also, I'm a few weeks later, I'm going to be talking to a 6th grade. I get invited to high schools. I've talked to college classes, so it's a range. So the older I get, I can get more into the complicated history. Sometimes if I'm talking about helpers, I can talk about at the younger level, a helper is simply sometimes the person that offered a word of comfort at a moment that was difficult. And at the older level, I can get into the complicated politics of the Polish embassy in Switzerland. So I grab different parts of the story at different times. I talk about concentration camp, and I might talk about the lack of food and the fact that there was illness and there wasn't any doctors and people got sick and that died, versus that it was an intentional way of eliminating a population by purposely starving them to death, but enough money and enough food, not money, enough food to keep them working. You emphasize different things within the same scene.
To share a brief anecdote, which sounds very similar to what you do, which is fantastic. For me personally, I heard my first Holocaust testimony in person in 5th grade. And the speaker who I heard was excellent at, kind of switching her story and highlighting different parts. And she spoke about her best friend who was Christian, and they used to, growing up, give each other cupcakes on the birthdays. And she talked about how one year suddenly she went to give her friend this cupcake on her birthday, And she threw it back in her face and spit on her and said, "We're no longer friends." And, as a little kid, that's a very impactful story because, we all have best friends. We all like cupcakes. I mean, and it really stuck with me. And I heard her later on in college, and it was a completely different approach, but equally impactful. And she was really great at, highlighting story bits that fit the right age group. So I really appreciate that you're able to do that because that's quite a talent.
So Sarah, you show us a beautiful way of introducing these concepts at young ages of, inclusion and appreciating different cultures and differences in people, and that, to clearly start building a foundation of tolerance, if you like to use that word. At what point is it sort of okay to actually say the words that Jews were targeted and killed? I mean, even if you don't want to show graphic images, at some point that's the actual message that needs to be
Mm.
said. And when can children really, hear that and not be, if you're a Jewish child, be terrified by it? Is that a okay question to ask?
Yeah, yeah. So personally, this is just solely on my own experience. Um, I lean towards middle school. Excuse me. I lean towards middle schoolers, um, because that sense of understanding is starting to develop. Um, and as Heidi said, I mean, there's different ways and of complexity of explaining that. And I think that starts the process of explaining it and adding on, the different layers and complexity of, who's involved, why it happened, who it happened to. And then I think you build on that and you continue to build on that. And that's, when I mentioned you start adding terminology when they're in 6th grade and in middle school, I think that opens up conversations of, okay, yes, you're going to talk about the Holocaust, but then what is the Holocaust? And who did it happen to? And so I think that's the age where you can start to introduce those things. And I know you mentioned kind of the graphics of it. I have a professor who once said to me, "You don't ever have to show a graphic photo to start to talk about the Holocaust." And I think that's very true, especially with children. You don't need to show them pictures of a concentration camp, or the ghetto to really start to understand the humanity of it or the lack of humanity of it. So I think middle school is a really good place to start with that, because it can build on, the empathetic and the, acceptance of others. And then you're moving into, okay, why do those things really matter? And look what happens when you aren't being accepting, when you aren't understanding of others. And so you kind of get past those lessons of being human and enter kind of into, the historical and also current events, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I would say middle school age.
So also the stories that are simple sometimes have a bigger impact on the kids. I mean, when I show a picture of my mom in 1st grade and all the kids are wearing the yellow star, and I explain she was not allowed to go to public school, and this was the makeshift Jewish school that was pulled together for these kids because they were not allowed to go. And I'm usually talking to a public school, and they're like, "What do you mean they weren't allowed to go to school?" Jews weren't allowed to go to school. So all these kids were not allowed in the public, and then they're like, huh? They suddenly get it. Like that means a lot more to them because they can relate to it, as opposed to some sort of concentration camp scene, which they can't relate to at all.
Right. I think your example goes really well with the Dr. Seuss book that I showed. They have these stars on their belly. And when you think about the context of it being in the Holocaust, of course, like a 2nd grader is not going to know that exists necessarily, but you can work that into a conversation and say, look, people did experience this. They were marked by stars at one point in time. And of course, in the book, being marked with a star was actually a good thing. But you can talk about how, this has happened. It wasn't a good thing. and explain that. So I agree. I think sometimes those simple stories, like the cupcake story for me, it was a very simple story, but I can tell you, still gets me. So
Mhm.
does anyone else want to share their experience or have any questions about working with kids or any questions in general?
I loved your idea of trying, if you're going to use survivor testimony, to try to pair it with somebody who was around the age of the children they're speaking to when things started to turn for them. I think that, like you said, it really can make a big impact.
I have an activity that I do actually with my students. So I worked significantly with artifacts throughout kind of my research, and I find that people in general really connect to objects because they can hold them, they can see them, they can relate because they have their own items. And one of the activities that we had them do is we have them fill out kind of like a card of their interests. So do you play sports? What sports do you play? Do you like to cook? Do you, what are your activities? And then we would pick out different artifacts from the Holocaust and show them to them. And we would have them build stories based off of them. Who might have had this? What did they do with it? And then what we would do, a lot of the artifacts would have the backstory of the individual who owned it. And so they would go through this process of getting to know the person through the artifact and then find out what happened to them. So in a way, it is very much one of those simple stories. You don't find out too much detail about this individual, but you start to construct who they might have been through objects. And so I find that that can also be a really good way to approach kids, is through things, because they all have their favorite stuffed animal or, their favorite sport or, whatever it is that they love. They can go ahead and have that and relate to it, and then relate to someone else having their favorite object as well.
Sarah, at what age do you recommend that we start talking to our children and grandchildren about this?
So I would say there's different brackets. So I would say kind of K-5, and of course it really depends on the child. But K-5, I would say, I would almost not use terminology yet. Certainly you can start to introduce concepts of the Holocaust. I would say middle school is when you can really start involving kind of the history of the Holocaust, who is involved, what is the Holocaust? I mean, that's a big question. Certainly we don't have an answer to it yet, I would even argue. And then in high school, really adding on, more information and adding on different layers of what the Holocaust is.
So do you recommend like linking it with a date, like Yom HaShoah is coming up? Do you say, do you know what today is? This is what it means. I mean, it just seems like how would you just bring it up in conversation? So it seems like you need to link it to something.
So this is something I thought about when I was making my PowerPoint, and a few things came up. So I think that is one really great approach, is to link it to an event that's coming up. I mean, certainly, as you mentioned, show is coming up very quickly. We also have the Butterfly Project, which is a great way to start bringing it up, or different events that happened throughout the year that's linked to the Holocaust. Also, kids are curious, they hear things and then they come home and ask questions. So that's also another way I envision that kind of occurring. I think it really is going to come down to the child and if they approach you. If they don't approach you, certainly link it to an event. Or if you have personal history, you can link it to that. So for example, if you have a family member who's linked to the Holocaust, you can do that. Or if you have maybe even going about the artifact process, if you have something in your house, But if you don't, then I would say, asking them even about what they're doing in school and saying, what have you started to learn? Because around middle school, I would say we have a lot of eighth grade schools or eighth grade classes that start to learn about the Holocaust. Certainly in the high school level, they start to really learn about the Holocaust. They might already be learning about it and have those conversations in classrooms. So there's a lot of different ways it could come up. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes we might just have to broach the subjects ourselves. So it really depends on the situation with a specific kid.
So if you're talking about
Thank
the
you.
K-5 group, obviously that's a wide range in terms of ages. So I think you're trying to say we can build on their knowledge base, starting at a young age with some of the books and then they can grow from there. Can you give us a little more specific about how you grow sort of age by age before you're ready, let's say in middle school, to introduce the terminology, the Holocaust and what it actually was? At what point do you build, we talk about accepting other people. At what point do we talk to children about maybe standing up for others and not being just a bystander, but an upstander, right? How do you grow those skills between kindergarten and fifth grade, let's say?
So I think that can start pretty early. Can start pretty early on. So for example, the Ugly Duckling book, I would recommend to, first, second, kind of onward. So it's a very young target age. And I think from that book on, each of those books kind of has, I would say, almost like an other or an outsider who's being targeted for one reason or another. And I think that gives you the opportunity to start saying, what could you do in this situation to make this, I mean, in this case, a swan, but, feel more accepted? And, how could you talk to your friends about including, this other kid? And you can also bring it to real life. I mean, you read the book and you can talk about how this little duckling isn't included. And then you can have a conversation with, have you ever seen this happen at school? Is there ever a time where you feel like you don't belong, or a friend, or you see someone who doesn't belong? So I think linking it to their real life experience is really important, because then, it's not just something that's happening in a book and always has a happy ending because of course it's a little kid's book. But then you can teach them, you have the opportunity to be the person who includes them and makes them feel better, and make a friend, and show them that there are benefits also for them to really engage with that person who feels like the outsider. So I think very early on you can talk about being an upstander and what that looks like. And I think a lot of ways being an upstander is the same when you're a little kid as when you're an older kid, which is great. I mean, even as adults, when we choose to be upstanders, it's very much the same thing, just the different methods of the way we go about it. So I think it's a really good point you make. But I would start very young. I mean, I think all of those activities allow for that conversation to be had.
I think the book you pulled out about immigration, I've never seen it, but it seems like that's a great place to start too. Especially with the Jewish community, everybody knows somebody whose parents came from somewhere else.
Yes.
Just everybody came from somewhere. And that's a great way to start the story and, discussion where, so you're friends with so-and-so, and yeah, her parents have an accent. Oh, that's because they're from they're from somewhere else. And why did they come from somewhere else? And when did they come from somewhere else? And what was going on somewhere else?
And I think, we also have different pockets of communities here. And, students don't necessarily get to engage. And so by having the conversation with the book, you can then bring it into the real world and say, who do you know that kind of you think of? And, how do you engage with them? And how can you help them feel more comfortable? And, do those sort of things, which links to the upstander part of it. And also learning about cultures. I mean, that links very well with the the bread book, which teaches you about different cultures and, really kind of not just seeing different cultures, but also honoring them and, teaching kids that being different is good. And, there's just so many different ways that you can be different, and how to honor that and also, respect that.
And I think so many of us now live in blended families of one kind or another. And so then within our own family, there's opportunities to point out differences and to point out how to judge or actually not judge people.
Right.
Yeah, when I talk, I have a slide I started using now. It's a picture of my father in a wheelchair, my youngest, who's got pink hair and tattoos and rainbow everything, and my oldest, who is Hasidic with the tzitzi and the yarmulke. And it's like, we are blended, we are everything, we are inclusive, and we just got to, I don't even say it's my family when I start talking about it. It's like, look at these people, they don't belong together, so to speak. And then I say they're all my family.
Yeah, I think it's a great approach. And it's funny, I know that I very much had a family like that, and I never noticed it until I got older, because I was so used to them that, this is just who I know and, who's around me. And then I got to a certain age and I thought, it's interesting, you don't pick up necessarily on that because it is so normal. And I had never thought to myself as a kid, we don't belong together, because that's just how I was raised. So I think that's a great way to pose it to kids, is look who's around you and take note of, how are we different, and look how great you can get along. And I would love to see that photo someday.
I'll show it to you.
Great.
There's also a difference if you're telling Jewish kids versus I go to school sometimes and there's no Jewish kid in the entire district. Yeah. So people who don't even know a Jew, I'm the only Jew around, that kind of thing. So it's different challenges.
Mhm.
Is it easier to explain to non-Jews or to Jews?
Ooh, great question.
Yeah.
The questions are just really different, I think. If they're not Jewish, they don't. I don't know. I think they're, first of all, they're surprised, like, oh, you're Jewish? I get that sort of, you don't look Jewish, you don't act Jewish. Well, what does a Jew look like and act like? There's that to deal with. But it's just a concept. It's not, I think the emotional impact is less. Whereas when I've gone to a Jewish school to tell the story, I know every single one of these kids has the potential of being worried about themselves, knowing that their grandparent went through it, knowing, I have a different sense of carefulness, if that makes, what am I being careful about? It's different in the two different groups.
It's interesting you say that. So I've also experienced, speaking to both groups, non-Jew and Jewish groups of students. And sometimes I find that Jewish students will come up to me and say, I already know all this. Can we stop? Can we, talk about something else? And it's very interesting to me. I can understand that. I mean, it's something that's a very heavy subject, can be very personal. And at the same time, I've had schools that, like you said, don't have a single Jewish child in the system, and they're very interested and they can connect to it in a different way. Whatever link they might have, they connect to it on some different level, and they want to learn more because they didn't know what had happened and they had not heard about it because they hadn't grown up in this sort of environment. And so it's interesting to hear, different responses from the different groups. And certainly, they're all going to respond differently as well as individuals.
Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank Dr. Sarah Snyder. This was very enlightening, informative. We appreciate all the information you've given us, and I would appreciate if you send me any of those lists. I'll certainly forward them on to the group. I do want to mention that some of you may have heard about it. The Butterfly Project is a project really spans internationally. It's a project that we're bringing to our community through the JCC and Voices of Hope. And basically, the basic premise is memorializing the 1.5 million children who were killed during the Holocaust. And we're doing that by painting butterflies, one for each child lost. And the goal, of course, is, worldwide is to get to 1.5 million. I think they're up to about 270 something thousand already. It's been in existence for over 10 years now.
Yeah.
So we are bringing it to the JCC. This Sunday, we're opening it to community members at 2:00. Anybody who'd like to come, paint a butterfly. There'll be a little educational film that explains about the project. And it's very meaningful, I have to say. We've been through it with a couple of groups already. I think you'll find it very meaningful. So if you can come by, just send me an email, let me know you're coming. Sunday, the 24th, 2:00 at the JCC. We'd love to have you participate. And we are saying it is open because of everything, consistent with everything Sarah has said, for middle school age children and up as well. And of course, Sunday evening is our community Yom HaShoah commemoration, 7:00 at the Emmanuel Synagogue. It's always open to the community, so we honor our survivors.
And actually, I'll be speaking with my mom and my brother and my nephew
say that.
during
So,
that.
wonderful. Yes. So, yes, this is something new we've done. We used to have survivors give their own personal testimony, and we've been including second and third generation descendants of survivors, and making it more of a family conversation. So we look forward to that.
Yeah, I get to ask the
Sharon, did you
questions.
say that? Oh, I'm sorry. Is it Sunday night or Monday night?
It's Sunday night, the commemoration Sunday night. If you're asking about Monday at the JCC, we usually do a whole day of reading of the names, and maybe you saw that is Monday, but our community Yom HaShoah commemoration is Sunday evening, 7:00 at the Emmanuel Synagogue, and Sunday at 2:00 at the JCC, the Butterfly Project. So hope to see you at one or both.
And what age is the minimum for bringing someone to the Butterfly Project?
We're saying middle school age and above, just
Okay,
like
so all right.
consistent with because the film that we're showing, it's mostly positive and hopeful, but there are, I would say, a few minutes
Okay.
where they are talking a little more graphically about the Holocaust.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you all for coming.
Wonderful presentation, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.